Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover a life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Hope After Child Loss. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and I wanted to welcome you to the podcast today. I have a guest that I think you're going to be real excited to hear. He is a prolific writer. I think he has 6 books to his credit now, 3 co-authored and 3 that he has written himself. He just retired as a pastor at the old age of 47 and is transitioning into some new roles. He's also a co-host of the very popular podcast at Nothing Is Wasted Ministries with Davey Blackburn. So Eric Schumacher, I just want to welcome you to our podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Greg. I'm excited to be here. It's an honor.
Well, it's an honor to have you. I appreciate you carving time out of that very busy schedule. Eric is also married to his wife, Jenny, and they have 5 children. So when I say a busy young man, he is indeed a very busy young man. Wears a lot of hats, don't you?
Oh, I try.
Well, I mentioned that Eric is an author, and the book that I would like to sort of focus in on today is entitled Ours, Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage. The title of that book really is why Eric is a guest on the show today, because he and his wife Jenny have experienced multiple miscarriages. And there are any number of books out there on that subject, but most of them focus in on couples and moms. Honestly, there's not a lot out there, for dads. So Eric, why did you specifically choose to write a devotional for that targets dads alone?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Greg. And the reason I wrote it is exactly what you said. I think the church has come a long ways in society in acknowledging and talking about miscarriage. There's a long ways to go, but I remember growing up, I don't think I'd ever heard of miscarriage until maybe I was in high school, and I heard of a relative having a miscarriage, and then that was probably it until maybe I was in seminary. We were married, and our friends were starting to have families, and a number, of couples that were friends getting pregnant and having miscarriages. But it was just something that I might hear happened. And it wasn't until I had a theology class with Russell Moore, who's now the editor of Christianity Today. He spoke openly about he and his wife's multiple miscarriages in our class and how it affected him as a man. And it's the first time I ever heard a man speak about his experience of miscarriage. And so that I didn't do a lot of thinking about it then, but that sort of paved the road as an example of remembering this brother who shared that suffering with us. And we had three successful pregnancies that ended in birth of healthy children. And so miscarriage wasn't really on my mind, though we knew a few people who had them. And then we had a miscarriage of our own very early in a pregnancy, so early that I think if Jenny hadn't taken the pregnancy test, we might have thought it was a late period.
Yeah.
And we didn't really know how to think or respond to that. It was a surprise pregnancy, so it came and went basically as soon as we knew about it. And we had a close relative that had a medical emergency with a pregnancy that was life-threatening and very traumatic. And so we chose not to share, and we had this idea of we didn't want to distract from that. And there's a lot to say about that. But it was after that we went on to have our daughter, our 4th living child, and then we ended up having 2 that were later on in the pregnancy and much more difficult for us to work through. And it was at that time that I started realizing there's really nothing out here for men who are grieving miscarriage. We've come a long ways, I think, in being able to talk about this. And there's good resources for women out there, and there's good Christian resources for women. But often, even if they're for couples, the chapter that addresses the husband, and it's usually a chapter, addresses here's how to care for your wife.
Right.
And
right.
there's nothing in there about your own heart and soul in the
Yeah.
middle of that loss. And so it's been a burden of mine to speak to men about this. And so a friend of mine, Emily Jensen, who is co-host of the Risen Motherhood podcast, invited me to write an article for women on the husband's experience of miscarriage so that they could understand what men are going through. And that article received a lot of positive feedback. I was getting phone calls and emails from men saying, can we talk? Because this is the first thing that's I've even come close to touching what I'm going through. And wives too, going, thank you so much for this, because I can't get my husband to open up, et cetera, et cetera. And so through that, I've been asked to contribute to a few things, a few projects, speaking from the man's point of view on miscarriage. And it eventually ended up, I contributed to a book for women. And when the book came out, Held by Abby Wedgeworth, it's a tremendous book on miscarriage for women. And it's probably one of my go-to resources. And when it published, I just probably a little bold. I emailed the publisher and said, you need to write one of these books for men because there's nothing out there and I want to write it.
Oh, wow.
And so they let me.
You got what you asked for, huh?
Yeah. They and to their credit, the Good Book Company, they really took a chance on this, because no one that we could find has written a Christian book for men on miscarriage. And so they didn't know whether it would sell or not. But they saw the need.
Yeah. Eric, from your own experience, because that's where you're coming from, and from conversations you've obviously had with other men, but what was it like for you? You've already described what the first miscarriage was like, and we don't come prepared for that or equipped for it. As we're growing up, even in the church, we didn't talk about things like that.
Yeah.
So when you and Jenny experienced that, you had to watch what she was going through, and as her husband, you wanted to try to support and encourage her and protect her. But where did that leave you? What was it that you were experiencing through all of that? I'm sure that there are dads that are listening that have experienced the same thing, but they don't know what to do with it, because typically as men, we're not too good with either processing or sharing our emotions. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think, if listeners went and looked up the article on Risen Motherhood website, Dad's Hurt Too, I think it's something like a father's memoir of miscarriage or something like that. I tell several stories there, and as I do in ours, what really surprised me was how many different ways you experience it. It's there was anger, there was shame, there was the grief of the loss, there was fear, there were so many things there. And I think what you touched on was you want to care for your wife in the middle of that, and especially when the miscarriage is coming with cramps or physical complications, and it's depending on the point in the pregnancy, and all sorts of factors can influence how physically difficult and painful this is. And so you want to be attentive to that. You kick into doer mode, caregiver mode, and you need to make sure the other children are taken care of, and you're going to get her medications, and you're bringing her meals, and you're doing all those things. And what you're not doing is grieving yourself. And
Sure.
And you're not grieving with her, which is something I like to remind men is that it's great that we want to do all these things to serve our family and serve our wife, but we typically have a church community and a circle of friends who can do a lot of those practical things. They can get meals, they can mow the lawn, they can run errands, they can watch the kids, but only you can grieve with her as her husband. And often that's what she wants, and often that's what you need. And one of the things I've seen as a pastor, as I've walked with other couples through miscarriage, and I think even our own, is it's natural to grasp that men and women respond to miscarriage differently. She's the one who's been physically pregnant, and she's the one whose body's going through the process of becoming not pregnant. And there's all sorts of, and the connection she's had with the baby in her womb, and the timing, the time and all that. But I think we forget that with every child, there's a father. And so with every miscarriage, there's a father who's lost a child. But what that does is I think the timing of our grief can be surprising, because the woman suffers the loss immediately. And I think there's often an immediate plunge into grief. Whereas the father, he knows the miscarriage is happening. He jumps into this doer role because there's a lot of things she can't be doing. And he's not even thinking about what this loss means often. Every miscarriage is unique. And that leaves the wife going, is he even sad? Am I grieving alone? Does this bother him? What's he feeling? What's he thinking? Why isn't he crying? And those are common questions I get from wives. And the husband's going, I don't even really know how I feel. I just want to make sure she's okay. I'm concerned for her. And a week or 2 weeks, depending on the situation, as she begins to be able to re-engage with the normal routine of daily functioning, as her body's recovering and those sorts of things, as he moves out of that practical caregiving sort of role, it begins to dawn on him, I find, that, oh yeah, here's what's lost. I'm not going to play catch with this baby in the front yard. And I'm not going to be doing this. And as her emotions begin to lessen, his are now increasing. And it can be difficult and surprising. Like, why is this all of a sudden coming up with me? But it's important. It's important to keep tabs on and to address.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when not long after we lost Ryan, doing some research on grief and the impact, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual impact that it has on the survivors. And one of the things that I found was so interesting as it relates to men is that so often the husband's grief is delayed. One statistic that I read that I was kind of amazed at was that for those who have lost a child, and this was really more referring to those who had a child who had been born and they had spent some months, years with the child, that very often for dads, the real impact of that grief didn't occur for about 8 years. And that's kind of where we are right now. We just went through the 8th anniversary of having lost Ryan. But that statistic really blew me away. But it really is in line with what you were describing, that we are so attentive as men in that protection role that we just, it's easier to just let that go because it's so hard for us to grieve with our wives, but we don't know how to express it. And I think sometimes we stay in a bit of a reserved mode because we don't want to add to her burden. I think all that you said is, it's so accurate, Eric. And let me ask you this, what surprised you about grief?
First, I just want to thank you for everything you just said. There's so many insightful things in there, I think, that people need to be aware of. And I would just add what you just said about we don't want to be a burden to our wives. I want to say this carefully because I don't want to guilt or shame anyone. But there is a sense in which it is a burden for a wife to have to grieve alone. Yeah. And if we are removing ourselves from her presence to tend to practical things because we don't know how to deal with our own grief, we may not actually be helping her. We may be hurting her unintentionally because what she needs is for someone to weep with her, not necessarily someone to get the groceries. And I think what you were just saying is one of the things that surprised me about grief is how extended it is. I like to say that miscarriage, like the death of any child, is a manifold loss. It has many, many waves and angles to it. And we tend to think of miscarriage, and it might be true of the death of a living child. We tend to think of it as an event. This happened, and now we're going to get through it. But we don't really understand the magnitude and the fullness of the loss that happened at the moment, because it's not just the loss of that person at that moment that's happened, it's the loss of our future with that person.
Absolutely.
And so I'm sure you've experienced this and are experiencing this with, the loss of Ryan. With a miscarriage, this happened, but then there's what would have been the due date, and what would have been baby's first Christmas and baby's first birthday. And 5 years down the road, everybody else in your church or circle of friends, their kids are going to kindergarten and they're posting first day of school pictures.
Yeah.
And that would have been you. And you can just track that through a lifetime. And there's a lot of factors, depending on the person and the number of other children they have, that can impact how difficult that is. Everybody's unique. But especially, I feel like with miscarriage, you didn't even get to hold that child while they were alive, at least. You may have after the miscarriage, but oftentimes not. Depending on whether you had a sonogram or a ultrasound, you may or may not have even seen the baby. But you as parents have this special, unique connection. Other people may have known that you were expecting. Sometimes they didn't.
Right.
And so you're very alone in this relationship that you had with this child. And so other people might hear about it, but they didn't know this baby. And they may be hearing about the pregnancy the same time they're hearing about the miscarriage. And so you can feel very alone in that loss, because there's often no funeral, there's no community gathering for that. And it's easy for us as friends of people who have a miscarriage to forget all the anniversaries that are coming up.
Yeah, the future grief, as we always refer to it. And,
yes.
Eric, I think in our culture, we have a tendency to, and I'll say this lovingly and gently as possible, but I think we have a tendency to downplay the impact, the grief, the pain, and the suffering that goes along with a miscarriage, because there is no physical baby for other people to see.
Yep.
And I think particularly those who are on the outside looking in do indeed see it more as an event that you referred to a few minutes ago. And for those of us who are the parents who have suffered through, yes, that was an event, but that event triggered all kinds of potential future opportunities in life that we now grieve when we think about losing that child. So for us, it wasn't so much of an event, but it was the anticipation of that life that would enter into our world. And then when the miscarriage occurred, suddenly that was over. And so we're left to grieve most often what you just said, a baby we never even got to hold in our arms, but we may very well have already named. In our case, we had 2 miscarriages, and in the second one, it was a little girl, and we already had her named. She came between our 2 children. So, yeah, those are tough situations, and we need to do a better job changing that narrative so that people understand that it's not an event. It's a long process.
Yeah. We did a panel discussion a few years ago at our church, and it was a series, and one of them was how to love people in your church who've been widowed. And one of the men who lost his wife to cancer in their 60s, he made this really insightful comment. A friend asked me the question, how are you going to get through this? And he said, get through what? He said, you lose your wife as an event brings about the loss of your wife, but it's not an event that you get through. It's a new reality that will always be your reality for the rest of your life, that you've
Right.
lost this person. You don't get through it. You live in that reality now, and there's healthier and less healthy ways to live in that reality.
Yeah.
But there's no past it because it doesn't change.
Eric, for you and Jenny, how did you guys navigate through this together? Because you obviously had to do this several times.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about the importance of grieving together, which means that in order to grieve together, you have to offer the gift of your presence
Mm-hmm.
to each other. And I think very often that's much easier for a woman to do than it is for a man. So how did you guys go about doing this to make that time so that you could grieve together through this and navigate through it together?
Well, I think we did it better sometimes than at others.
Hmm.
I think we grew in our ability to face the loss and grieve. I think with our first one, neither of us knew how to feel. And that's a part of miscarriage, is especially in a culture that doesn't value life in the womb. There is a real sense of, is this a legitimate loss? Do I have a right to feel anything about it? And of course you do. You know,
Yeah.
In the beginning of Luke's gospel, when John the Baptist leaps in the womb of Elizabeth in the presence of his Lord, Luke records, that the baby leapt in her womb, and that word for baby that's there in the Greek is the same word for baby that it's when it says that Mary laid the baby in the manger.
Right.
It's the same thing. It's in the eyes of Scripture, and so of course it's legit. But then we question: is it as legit of a loss as someone whose pregnancy was further along, or someone whose child was born, and all those little things come into your mind. And so I think with our first one, it's been so long ago now, but if memory serves me correct, we didn't talk about it much, and I don't think we dealt with it much. And we just sort of moved on.
Yeah.
And then with the next two, each had its own unique medical challenges and needed different sorts of medical care. And so there was much more involved with it. And I think we did better at talking about it and being conscious of each other's grief and taking the time to mourn and to let other people in the church serve us.
Yeah.
And then our fourth one was a surprise pregnancy after we thought we were done having children, which had a whole other set of issues, but it was also early in the pregnancy. We had just moved. We were at a new church, new city, new home, new set of friends, and we chose. There was all sorts of emotions. We didn't share it very publicly, but we did do. I could tell we did, I think, a much better job of asking each other how we were feeling and how we were doing, and talking about it. I think and so I share all that to say to listeners, give yourself grace, because you probably haven't. Most people haven't seen someone up close and personal grieve a loss. No one's probably taught you how to do it. And so you're in new territory as you're hurting. And that's okay. It's death is unnatural. It's part of the curse. It shouldn't happen. And we're not made to die. We're not made to walk through death of others. And let those emotions out. Don't be afraid to talk about them. Don't be afraid to ask each other questions, and give each other grace. When someone says, I don't know how I'm feeling, it's okay to not know how you're feeling. And so for us, it was learning by experience of walking through it. I think one of the benefits I've had as a pastor, it's a strange benefit, but I've been able then to walk through this with a lot of other people. And I tend to be an internal processor, an introspective person. And so I've thought a lot about my own experiences. And then I've tried to enter into and really ask good questions and listen to other people in that experience. And that helps us begin to understand what people need.
Yeah, I think only until you've experienced a level of suffering like that up close and personal can you really be that compassionate
Hmm.
and understanding towards somebody else who's now going through it. And you and I both know that if we lean into God when these things happen and allow ourselves to walk through that and experience the pain and experience the loss and all those cascades of emotions that come with it and give it to Him, that He will use that suffering for good in somebody else's life.
Hmm.
It's amazing how many opportunities He will present
Hmm.
when you allow Him to do that. It's
Mm-hmm.
like when you suffer the loss of a child, you suddenly become aware of all of these other
Hmm.
people that they just
Yeah.
suddenly start coming into your life. I know you guys have experienced that as well. So let me ask you this from a different perspective. What did you guys observe in those people in your life that were looking in on this? How
Hmm.
did they respond to what you guys were going through? Of course, as much as you would let them in on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think just like our own responses to our miscarriages, there are some people who responded better than others.
Yeah, of
And
course.
and in acknowledging that, I want to encourage us to give grace to people are uncomfortable with grief and mourning and sadness, and they want to say things to relieve their own tension in the moment. And so they often end up saying things that can be hurtful or insensitive,
Yeah.
unthoughtful. And so, that happens. There are, it's common for people to say, well, it's better off because there must have been something wrong with the baby,
Yeah. Yeah.
which has a whole host of issues. People who have babies who are born with genetic defects and disabilities and illnesses and diseases. Like, what have you just said about their children? And I mean, essentially, you're saying, without thinking about it, your life would be better off if your child was dead, and that's just a horrible thing to say.
I know.
And but it's easy for people to say, and it's unhelpful in the moment.
Right.
Or people even will say, and I often try to be careful with this myself. I was sharing with one person one time, someone that we hadn't really, someone close to us we hadn't really talked about our miscarriages with, and I mentioned, well, we've had 4 miscarriages, and this person immediately responded with, well, when we had our 5 miscarriages, and it was, I didn't know they had miscarriages, and I would want to grieve with them on that, but it almost felt like our grief was sort of shoved aside and short-circuited by, we've been through this. I try not to say to people, I know how you feel.
Right.
Because I don't.
No.
I don't know the unique set of circumstances that anybody else who's had a miscarriage or lost their child is in, because every single one is unique. It's a different place in life. It's a different marriage. It's a different person with a different history. I don't know what it's like. I can feel some similar things. I think I can, through my imagination, empathize with some things. But I want to offer my experience as an invitation for them to ask questions,
Right.
and use me as a resource in that grief. But what's really important is for that person to understand their loss at that time,
Right.
and to process that, not to process mine. I think, thinking about Men Grieving Miscarriage, after one of ours that we were in the hospital, Jenny labored and delivered the baby. The whole church knew then. So we're returning to the church community. I remember asking Jenny if she was ready to go back to church. And I might have gone back one Sunday before. Her comment was, I'm anxious about it because I'm afraid that everybody's going to come up to me and talk about it. And I'm also afraid that nobody's going to talk to me about it.
Man, I want that to sink in because we experienced that too. And I found that is so universal in other parents whether it's a miscarriage or whether it's, the child has lived for a few decades. That is the fear. And it took us 2 months to go back to church after it happened for those exact same reasons, Aaron.
Yeah. And I think that's where, as a man, what I experienced was, boy, if there's people I know who were there during it and are listening and I've overlooked you, forgive me, because this is just my memory, of the experience. But I remember one man coming up to us and giving me a hug and, weeping with me and telling me how sorry he was and asking me how I was doing. Lots of others talked to me about it, but the question was always, how's Jenny doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that kind of compounds the idea that you're not supposed to mourn this,
right.
As a man. And I think, what we've just both acknowledged is that fear of we're afraid that everyone's going to come up to us and talk to us about it. And Jenny, especially, she does not like to be at the center of anyone's attention.
Yeah.
If we're going someplace and I'm speaking, she's like, don't introduce me and definitely don't make me stand up. I'm happy to be, totally unknown in the room.
Right.
And so, but at the same time, you want people to acknowledge that loss. And so I think, I think one of the things that can be helpful is for people to come up and acknowledge the loss by name. We're sorry you lost your baby. We're sorry that you lost Ryan. But to also realize they're not your therapist, and they don't need to stand in the hallway and grill you with 20 questions, thinking they're helping you grieve when that's not the best thing in that moment. Like, just to be sensitive to what the grieving person is, where they're at. Sometimes it's open-ended questions or invitations and letting them kind of lead you in how far in that conversation they want to go.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of I think, a very powerful principle that came out of the book of Job, where his life literally was shattered beyond any reasonable ability to understand. And his friends come and show up. And for 7 days, man, they just get it exactly right. They sit with him and offer the gift of their presence. And then they screw it up by opening their mouths and offering all of this unwanted and unnecessary advice because they didn't understand. And that provided a lot more hurt and pain for Job. So sometimes just simply offering the gift of a hug or the gift of your presence without any words and leaving that door open for you to then share if you're able to do it at that moment, or if you need to at that moment.
I think that's such a good word, because I think especially in Christian circles, we want to spiritualize things so quickly. And there are important theological discussions to have and questions to ask, and there are times that are for that, and there's times, for everything there's a season. There's times that we shouldn't be entering into that, and there's people that can say things to us because of the relationship they have with us, and there's people who can't or shouldn't. And in fact, an illustration, and this might horrify some people, but shortly after one of our miscarriages that was particularly difficult, I had a friend from out of state, a very close friend, call me and, to express his sympathies to me. And he said, I want to remind you that God loves you, and not just in spite of this. He loves you through this. And he allowed this to happen precisely because he does love you. And because of our relationship, he could say that to me. But a random person or someone I didn't know well walking up to me in the church the next Sunday and going, God allowed this to happen because he loves you. It would have landed very differently. And they shouldn't and couldn't have said that to me. And that's something we need to be very sensitive. And I think, I was just have a book coming out on the topic of weakness, and one of the chapters is on weakness in wisdom literature in the Bible. And I was thinking about, I was looking at Job and the limitations of human wisdom. And one of the principles at the end of that book is Job isn't given an answer as to why God did this. And the reason he's not given an answer is, God asks him, can you understand all of creation from my perspective? And Job's conclusion is, I have spoken things that are too wonderful for me to understand, meaning they are literally beyond me as a human being. It's not just that God hasn't shown me all the answers, it's that I cannot understand those answers because as a finite being, I cannot stand in the place of God and grasp things as he grasps things. I'm literally not able. And God can't make me God. He can't make me see things from his perspective,
right?
Which calls for faith. And so we need to be really careful when we say things like, well, what is God teaching you through this? There are lessons we can grasp and there are lessons we can understand, but that quick drive to what do you think God's teaching you through this? Sometimes we don't know what God's doing through it at all.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And
don't you think, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
go
there, but especially because it's something that's, we want answers when things like that happen.
Yeah.
And it's so hard sometimes just to accept that we, on this side of heaven, we may never know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because just the way that we're wired, we want to know why. And God is not obligated to tell us why. He obligates himself to walk with us through it and to grieve with us and to help us through it.
Yeah. And I think along with that, that's such an excellent point is what's our obligation in the face of loss? Well, what we're called upon to do is to trust our Lord and Savior. Not necessarily to understand why. We're called to believe that Jesus Christ has entered into the human experience. He became like us in every respect, but without sin. He lived this human life for us. He suffered grief and loss, just as we have. But he trusted God perfectly through all of it. He died on the cross for my sins, and he has forgiven my sins. He's been raised from the dead. He's conquered sin, death, and the devil. He promises me that he'll be with me, never leaving me or forsaking me. And on the last day, he's going to raise me from the dead to live with him forever in a new heavens and a new earth where there's no sadness, no grief, no tears, no death, no sickness. And my call is to trust him in all circumstances, just to simply trust him and walk with him through that. And so it's good to have reminders of, I don't know what you're experiencing, but Christ is for you and you can trust him.
Absolutely.
Like, that is such a good word in the midst of grief. But for someone to come and go, what do you think God's teaching you through this? What principles are you drawing? What lessons are you learning through this? Is basically to come with the law and, to come and land on a person and go, hey, how are you doing on your homework right now in the face of your loss? And now you're like, I can't even process my own feelings. And now I just feel guilty because I didn't even know I had this assignment. And I guess I'm already behind on the deadline.
I think that comes out of, well, I'm not sure what it comes out of, but it's a total lack of understanding of what that individual is going through and trying to process. Because in those early stages of grief, nothing makes a whole lot of sense to begin with. You're in such a state of shock. And that doesn't just end at some particular point on the calendar. As we talked about much earlier, it's a process that continues on. And the other aspect of what we've been talking about too, Eric, is that even if God did give us the answers that we were looking for, it wouldn't change anything.
Yeah.
The result's the same.
Yep.
And the question I think we probably should consider is, could I handle it if God did give me the answer? Because I am finite. And so maybe he knows that we couldn't handle it. So he's kind and gracious enough not to give us those answers we're looking for. And simply, as you said, to trust him through it.
And I find that as I've walked with grieving spouses, who've lost their spouse, grieving parents who've lost a child in the church, and we're prone to play those games ourselves of why, God, why? We're asking that question of why. And we can sometimes run through the scenarios, and I don't say this to people who are doing that, but what quickly becomes apparent is as you watch that or listen to that or do that yourself, is you can run all the scenarios you can possibly think of about why God did this, and in the end, none of them are satisfying.
Exactly.
Because you get to the thing you think he's doing through it, and you go, but he could have done it a different way.
Right.
And I think there's a lesson to be learned from Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, who knew the end game.
Yeah.
He knows he's going to raise him from the dead. He knows he's about to be crucified himself and be raised from the dead. He knows he's going to return to make all things new. And he weeps bitterly at the tomb. He's going to see Lazarus in 5 minutes. And he weeps bitterly because that is the right response to death, is to weep over it and grieve over it and hate it because it's wrong. And he doesn't, when he sees Mary and Martha weeping over their brother dead in the tomb and asking, and going, if you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. Jesus doesn't say, well, cheer up, and in only a matter of time, it's all going to be made better. Or no, he weeps with them, and not, he doesn't weep as a good example. He weeps because he hates death and he loved his friend. It's real and it's genuine. It's not a show. And that's how we should be in the midst of loss as a friend.
Exactly. Romans 12:15 says, celebrate with those who celebrate, grieve with those who grieve. And that's exactly what you were saying Jesus was doing. He was grieving with them. And he was also grieving because he lost a friend.
Yeah.
Even though he knew in 5 minutes he was going to have that friend back again.
Yeah.
But it was the right response.
Yeah. I think that is, that's just such an important thing. We don't have homework. We don't have homework in grief.
God's much more gracious than we are to each other sometimes.
Yeah. And to ourselves.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last question here, Eric. What would you say that God has done in using your grief and suffering to shape you into who you are today and what you're doing? I know in a lot of respects you have already answered that, but is there anything else that you would add to that?
I think, it's interesting how we view ourselves sometimes. Like at the start of this podcast, you said, well, Eric is a prolific author. And I'm kind of looking around like, who are you talking about? Because I don't think of myself that way. But 6 books is a lot. I guess that is prolific, especially in 6 years. I think my first book came out in 2020, so it's 6 books in 4 years. And
in my world, it is.
And I'm going, oh yeah. And I have people saying that, like that's really busy, or you have a lot on your plate. And I tend to think, well, I'm not doing enough. Or 4 miscarriages is a lot. 1 miscarriage is a lot. But I think there was a season I went through that going, oh, well, we haven't suffered. This isn't, and I think through the perspective, and maybe it has to do with being a pastor or an introspective person, but looking back and going, okay, so we have walked through something that's substantial, and there are things that we do understand better now. And I've really asked the question, and I want to be really careful in how I say this, but the Lord's helped me learn how to steward my sufferings in order to care for other people. Yeah. And the reason I want to be careful in saying that is I hate it and I don't think that's too strong of language, when people say to grieving people, well, God's going to use this because now you're going to be able to comfort other people in the same situation, which immediately turns this into an assignment.
Right.
And wow, that's not going to be for years, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's different in everybody's story. So I don't want listeners to go, oh, I've had these sufferings and I'm not writing books or I'm not on podcasts,
Right.
or some people, I don't even know how to talk to my friend about the same circumstance. We're all, God gifts and equips and calls us all in unique ways. But one
Yes, he
thing that I've tried to really do is to sit down and, as much as it's been possible, is to re-enter my own experiences and to remember and to try to process, what was I thinking and what was I feeling in those moments? What is it that I wish someone had done? What really helped? What really hurt? And not even to just ask, what were the things they did or said that hurt or helped, but why did those things hurt or help? I want to get at the what was I needing?
Right.
Underneath that, because it's not a matter of imitating the same actions and words for other people. It's a matter of trying to understand the human heart in the midst of grief, and then how Christ connects with that and how his people can connect with that. And so I think that's one thing the Lord has helped me to some small degree to be able to do, is just to be more compassionate and have more empathy with my neighbor.
That's so important, because it can make all the difference in their world at that time. Because as you said earlier, there's a time and place for everything, and sometimes the most impactful words are not the words that are used early on. They may be later on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes early on, it's just the fact that, as we talked about earlier, that you show up and you just offer a hug, or you offer just to sit with them. That may be all that they need at that time. It may be all that they can receive at that time. So we've just got to be sensitive to the other person, not thinking about ourselves and what should I do or what should I be to that person at this moment, but just simply to think more about them and less about me, and me trying to put a Band-Aid on a surgical wound potentially.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's good.
Eric, I do want you to take just a minute to go back to the book, Ours, Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage. That book has the potential to really benefit men who are listening right now, or if you're a mom listening and your husband is grieving. He obviously is. You've been trying to think of resources or things you can do to help him. This is a book that might be exactly what he needs at this particular moment in time. So thank you for writing that. Thank you for taking the time to encapsulate your journey and the impact that miscarriage had in your life into this book. I also want to mention that Eric is co-authoring, or has co-authored, a devotional along with Jessica Sanders of Praying Through Ministries. And that book is still, I understand, a few months away from publication.
I think it releases July 1.
July 1. Okay. Tell us just real briefly a little bit about that, but don't go too far, because in just a few weeks, I'm going to have Eric come back again, and we're going to record an episode with he and Jessica, and they're going to be talking about this book.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that question.
Yeah.
And just to elaborate a little bit more on Ours, Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage, it might be helpful for listeners to hear what the book is like. It's 31 devotions, and it moves through the book of Luke from start to finish. And what I did was I surveyed men and some women who'd been through miscarriage and asked, what are the questions and the circumstances that you encountered as you were going through miscarriage? And then I compiled a list of 31 questions and then paired them with the Gospel of Luke as you move through it sequentially, with passages that I thought kind of spoke to those questions. And so they're short devotions, 800 to 1,000 words that are aimed at specifically answering a question that will often come up for men who are grieving miscarriage, trying to cover as much as I can the gamut of emotions and situations. And so if you're a man who says, I'm not a reader, I don't read books, or I just can't read a book right now, this isn't sitting down to read a 60,000 word Christian living book.
Yeah.
It's a short reading for each day. And I went through a gospel because I wanted men to walk with Jesus through this and encounter him in the midst of it. And there's a corresponding book that goes through a psalm for women, and that book is held by Abby Wedgeworth. And the Good Book Company, who's the publisher, has a good deal on sets of that. And so if you're in that experience, I'd encourage you to check it out. Or even if you're not, I encourage people to pick up a set, because it's great to have on hand for when your friends experience miscarriage, to be able to go with a care package and go, hey, I just wanted to drop these off. They might help. In His Hands is a prayer book for families who are facing a medical crisis with a child or a baby in the womb, whether that's an extended PICU journey or childhood disease, extended childhood illness, or child loss and miscarriage. And so Jessica and I have tried to think through sort of a broad spectrum of situations and circumstances that parents might find themselves in. And so sometimes when we're in these situations, we know we should pray, but we just can't even find words. And so we've taken a lot of scripture and turned it into prayers for situations like going to an appointment, getting a diagnosis, packing up a nursery that a child won't be living in. Just a lot of different things there to give parents words to pray when they don't know what to pray. And even children, there's prayers in there for the children as well.
Man, that is so good. Eric, thank you so very much. It's been an honor to have you on the podcast today. And I look forward to having you back again in a few weeks with Jessica. And if you can't remember the name of the book, if you're driving right now, the book we've talked about today, Ours, Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage, I will have that in Eric's episode description. And I believe that book can be purchased through Amazon, and I'm sure through many other outlets as well.
Any place books are sold should be able to get it.
Perfect. Thanks for making it easy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Greg, for having me on. I love what you're doing on this podcast. It's such an important ministry, and I'm honored to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Eric.
If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope@emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening